What's $1 million represent to you? Being able to buy a fast car or a fancy jet? Maybe buying enough Crunchwrap Supremes to last you over 900 years? Buying a house? Yeah, that's the best joke I've ever told on this channel. Andrew Lloyd Webber is one of the richest composers in history. And if you don't recognize him, you'll definitely recognize his works.
Tony-winning Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Broadway's hottest musical composer.
Today, Phantom of the Opera is the longest-running show in Broadway history.
The longest-running show in Broadway history.
Joseph the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Cats, Starlight Express, Phantom of the Opera, Sunset Boulevard.
Are you generous?
Generous?
I think you are.
It's not for me to answer that.
So when he lost over $1 million in 1994, it's safe to say that the financial hit was barely even noticeable. No, what really packed a punch was the damage it did to his pride and his reputation. Instead of being a grand return to the stage, Sunset Boulevard became a three-ring circus of controversy and rumors when the show's lead actress, Patti LuPone, was unceremoniously fired before the show made its move to Broadway.
There is a big leading lady brouhaha brewing on Broadway.
That was a Greek tragedy. Not the experience, the play.
Everybody in the company in some way suffered at the hands of a certain individual and his company.
It made me wonder how a professional relationship that spanned nearly 20 years could fall apart in just a few hours. But the deeper I dove, the clearer it became that this was more than just a fight over money or contracts. No, this was a conflict of trust and betrayal, all of which raises the question, what's $1 million worth to you? But before we dive in, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to this video's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh has been a huge supporter of Wait in the Wings, and I can't tell you how much of a miracle it's been personally for my health and my well-being. Considering I spend basically 16 hours a day researching, writing, and getting roasted by the Patreon Discord, remembering to eat is pretty hard. But thankfully, HelloFresh makes it that much easier for me to survive because they take the guesswork out of my meals. HelloFresh's quick and easy recipes makes mealtime, and even better, cleanup, a breeze. So go to HelloFresh.com and use code WAITINTHEWINGS16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. I don't know what the gifts are. I hope it's a Lambo. Again, that's HelloFresh.com and code WAITINTHEWINGS16. And we're recording. With how bitter and frustrating the ending to this story is, I think we should go back and look at a different time. This is an article I found from the September 20th, 1991 issue of the New York Times. In it, writer Alex Witchell describes the scene at the Sidmonton Festival, which is an annual workshop that Lloyd Webber holds on his sprawling 5,000-acre estate. Just 2 years before this same ink would be dipped in venom, the vast majority of the industry couldn't wait for Lloyd Webber's new musical, Sunset Boulevard. Based on the 1950s film, the show followed Norma Desmond, a star of the silent films, whom Hollywood quickly dumps after the movies turn to sound, and she's no longer of use to them. Remember that. That's gonna be relevant later. After the full piece was performed at the Sidmonton Festival in September of 1992, the media speculation on who would star as Norma Desmond ran the gamut of star leading ladies, with columnist Liz Smith stating it was down to Meryl Streep, Barbra Streisand, and Glenn Close. But soon, the papers deduced that the main competition was actually just between 2 people, Meryl Streep and an actress named Patti LuPone. The star of his 1979 smash hit Evita, LuPone's no bullshit attitude has basically made her theater lore.
If you don't want to follow the rule, get the f*** out!
Stop taking pictures right now! You heard the announcement? Who do you think you are?
So not someone you want to mess around with. Given her talent and the Tony Award winning performance she pulled out for Evita, LuPone was the first person Lloyd Webber contacted to bring Norma Desmond to life for the Sidmonton Festival. And still, the speculation of who would play the lead role lasted for months, with articles declaring that Meryl Streep was strong-arming her agents to get her the part, and they even went so far as announcing in early November that she'd won it. The conflict ultimately ended later that November when Lloyd Webber declared that LuPone would be playing Norma Desmond in London. So that's it, right? After an intense battle of uncertainty, LuPone emerged victorious, right? Well, the problem is that the entire feud between Streep and LuPone never really existed, at least not to LuPone. Let me explain. After her performance at the Sidmonton Festival in September, she was told that night that she'd gotten the part, making things all the more confusing when the papers announced that Streep had won the role, because that same day that they reported it, LuPone's agent was already starting negotiations, and she even received a letter from director Trevor Nunn about how excited he was to be working with her again. And yet, despite the feud between Streep and LuPone never really existing, neither Lloyd Webber nor his production company, Really Useful Group, ever tried to smother the flames. Given the specificity of the leaks, LuPone alleges in her memoir that they actually came from Really Useful itself, using Streep and LuPone as publicity pawns to increase the prestige of Sunset Boulevard. Making this fiasco worse, LuPone would later be passed over for singing the show's two big songs for a recording in favor of Barbra Streisand. The feeling that she was replaceable at any moment became more evident, a fact that LuPone wasn't going to take lying down. Now, to understand the rest of this story, we need to understand the path that a Lloyd Webber show typically takes to get to Broadway. It's super rare that a Lloyd Webber musical opens on Broadway first. It usually starts in London to refine and build hype before jumping across the pond and dealing with the famously unkind US critics. But with Sunset Boulevard, Lloyd Webber decided to follow the same path to Broadway that he did in 1979 with Evita. So he would first open a production in London, and then another in LA, until the final production opened in New York. This would mean that there would be 3 productions of Sunset Boulevard running at the same time. LuPone fought tooth and nail to debut as Norma in all 3, but the Really Useful Group protested, claiming that if LuPone did the show in Los Angeles, then she'd have to cut her run in London short. Reluctantly, LuPone gave in and agreed to bypass LA. But out of fear of being replaced by the actress they'd choose for Los Angeles, she sure as hell wasn't going to the UK without a contract stating she'd be playing the role in both London and New York. Ultimately, she'd sign a contract agreeing to this stipulation. But Los Angeles still presented a big problem for LuPone. Having someone else debut as Norma in between her London and New York runs opened the door to comparisons and unwanted competition. As LuPone prepared to board her flight to start London rehearsals, her agent reached out to tell her that Lloyd Webber held a press conference to announce the LA lead for Sunset Boulevard. It was Hollywood superstar Glenn Close. LuPone was livid. Her fear of comparisons wasn't exactly unfounded, as the narrative of Sunset Boulevard shifted from the excitement of the London opening to speculation on who would actually take the show to New York. Glenn Close or Patti LuPone? Even though Really Useful was adamant that LuPone would be opening Sunset on Broadway, she'd already been positioned as a second fiddle, so understandably, there was reason for concern. If there was one thing that was going to make or break Patti LuPone, it was what the critics had to say about the London production. So these are the biggest reviews from Patti LuPone's opening night performance of Sunset Boulevard in London from 1993. Reading through them, reactions were definitely mixed. But to Lloyd Webber, it was this one that really got under his skin. The New York Times review from critic Frank Rich. The feud between these two was legendary, with Lloyd Webber constantly feeling that Rich just had it out for him. As one of Lloyd Webber's close friends once told him, he doesn't like what you do. He doesn't like what you've done to the American theater. Therefore, he is never going to like anything you do. Why don't you just let it go? Out of pride and perhaps a touch of sensitive desire for approval from the hardened critic, Lloyd Webber personally invited a slew of US critics, including Frank Rich, to the London opening, even though he originally wasn't going to. Rich surprisingly took it easy on the show and wasn't extremely negative about it. That is until it came to LuPone. Out of the 1,414 words of his review, 415 of those are dedicated solely to LuPone's performance. Despite receiving multiple standing ovations, it was just those 415 words from Frank Rich that Lloyd Webber would not let go of. And then a few months later, the reviews for Glenn Close's LA production came out. They were glowing. With 1 month left on her London contract before making the jump to New York, LuPone received a phone call in her dressing room on February 16, 1994. An article from columnist Liz Smith was released with a headline reading, "It's Glenn as Norma," going further to say it isn't even a bet, it's a fact. She'll begin rehearsals in New York on August 1st. LuPone's agent called to tell her it was true. She'd been fired. LuPone went mad, lifting up a floor lamp in her dressing room and destroying everything in sight. Her delirious and pain-filled screams complementing the sound of smashing glass before she threw the lamp out the window and walked out before the show even started. The next day, LuPone received a letter from Andrew Lloyd Webber. As LuPone states in her memoir, "He wrote me to say how sorry he was that he couldn't give me the news personally, because he was on his estate in Sydmonton. For the record, Sydmonton is just 60 miles west of London. He assured me that he was as upset about the situation as I was. He claimed to have put everything he had into his efforts to get me to Broadway as Norma, and that the bad US reviews of the London production had almost killed any chances of mounting the show in New York." Lloyd Webber continued to assert that it wasn't him making the decisions. It was all Paramount Pictures. And I mean, that makes sense. Paramount owned the rights to Sunset Blvd, the film, so it was entirely feasible. The problem is, a month later, a spokesperson for Paramount told the Los Angeles Times Paramount had no conversations with Lloyd Webber about casting. It was all in his court. And even though he knew that he made the decision, any response in any publication varied from, "I know nothing," to, "This is more a public humiliation for me than it is for her." Regardless, LuPone put on a brave face and finished her run of performances in London. No matter how big the box office advance was, or how warmly she was received each night, after that last performance, she was quickly dumped when she was no longer of use to them. And then came the lawyers.
The LuPone saga involves composer and not exactly beloved impresario Andrew Lloyd Webber, who hired Patti to be the first Norma Desmond in his London Sunset Boulevard and said, it is reported, she would be Norma in New York. But Glenn Close, who first did the show in L.A., she went to New York. And Faye Dunaway, she was dismissed in L.A., but she sued and she got a nice settlement. And Betty Buckley is happy too because she's Norma in London and soon she'll be Norma in New York.
Now remember, LuPone was still under contract to perform as Norma Desmond in New York, which meant Lloyd Webber had two options. He could either buy Patti LuPone out of her contract, or he could see her in court. According to the Associated Press, LuPone was making roughly $30,000 a week in London, and was signed to perform for 9 months in New York. Now, assuming that she'd still be making the same amount that she was in the UK, LuPone would be missing out on nearly $1,170,000 from that New York run. And then, when you add in the public humiliation and the embarrassment she had to go through, to buy her out of that contract undoubtedly would need to be a lot more. LuPone's lawyer, John Breglio, flew to London and negotiated terms, speaking only to the CEO of Really Useful Group, Patrick McKenna, who would then relay the messages to Lloyd Webber, who was in a separate room. In total, the intense negotiations took 15 hours, before Lloyd Webber finally settled on a lofty, classified amount. The experience of March 1994 traumatized LuPone both emotionally and physically. Even though she'd gotten a nice payout from Lloyd Webber, it felt like blood money. Ultimately, she took the settlement and put it towards building a pool in her backyard, which she named the Andrew Lloyd Webber Memorial Swimming Pool. So, why does this story matter? Especially now. The day that I really started researching this video, on May 1st, 2022, I was scrolling through Twitter when I came across this article from Playbill, announcing that Lloyd Webber's new Cinderella musical would close on June 12th. But what really got me about this article is that at the same time I was reading it and learning that the show was going to close, so too were the current and future cast members that were set to begin rehearsals in June. Over 20 years since Patti LuPone learned of her firing from a newspaper article, almost every person in the Cinderella cast and crew found out via the internet. Of course, Really Useful tried to get ahead of this by saying everyone involved in Cinderella was contacted by call, email, or in person, and even went so far as calling this a callous attack on the dignity of the Cinderella company. But now that you know this story, you have a right to be skeptical about that. The key to a successful life is compassion, collaboration, and taking responsibility. Now, there's no denying that Andrew Lloyd Webber's contributions to the theater are massive. He completely changed the game. But as much as he'd probably hate to admit it, it wasn't all just because of him. And yet it seems like anytime we've talked about Lloyd Webber on this channel, he'll always be quick to accept responsibility for the good, but anytime anything bad happens, he throws it on to someone else. Sunset didn't do well in London? It was Patti LuPone's fault. Starlight Express didn't do well in New York. He let the audience know that it wasn't his idea to give it a full staging. The examples are numerous. And what's even more frustrating is that you know it's not just Lloyd Webber doing this. Whether it be the West End, Broadway, or regionally, the battle between arts and commerce continues to rage on, just as it has before our time. It's the ugly side of theater and our species that so many of us try to ignore. It's humanity being sacrificed for pride and profit. So, I have to ask you once again. What's $1 million worth to you?